Ever wonder about the weather? Its violent storms, mudslides, and floods recently caused many deaths and millions in damage. Could El Nino be a classified cover-up? The U.S. government has been testing a weapon in the brush country of Alaska that manipulates the environment and changes weather patterns. The military calls it HARP, High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program. This device turns on lights never intended to be artificially manipulated. HARP is working thousands of miles through the sky and down into the polar ice caps. This vibrating antenna sends electromagnetic radiation raining down on the Earth. Angels don't play this HARP, says Dr. Nick Begich. Advances in Tesla technology, a book you won't want to set down. Angels Don't Play This HARP reveals a U.S. military secret project with surprises from secret meetings that they don't want you to know about.
But there are some very unusual things occurring. For instance, here in Alaska, you have the HARP facility at Gokona. What people don't realize is being built in Kodiak, Alaska, not too far away, is another phased array antenna system that's part of a global radar system. However, it will be used in conjunction with HARP. That happens to be sitting on the same magnetic line of force, interesting and coincidentally enough, as HARP. When you look then at where that line of force terminates, it terminates in Canada, which happens to be the location, as we understand it, of a new polar cap facility being installed there. So you have 3 points along the same line, each capable of reading or sending energy into that same magnetic line of force. And part of this whole idea is, if you energize those magnetic lines of force, that energy uses what naturally occurs, and visualize this in your mind, the planet Earth with these lines coming from the South Pole out above the atmosphere and then back into the North Pole. Well, the energy travels from south to north. But when you inject energy with these special antennas into those magnetic lines, they act like a guide. So the energy sort of corkscrews around that magnetic line and goes from north to south. In other words, it goes the opposite direction. And that's one of the ways they envision creating this global effect with these small transmitters in Alaska and others around the world. Small by comparison to natural systems, huge by comparison to anything contemplated by man. Could it affect polar shifts or polar activity? Nobody knows the answer to that. But again, when you're already observing a highly disturbed system, the last thing you do is pour more gas on a flaming fire. And that's our position on HARP, is we're pouring gas on that flaming fire.
Your biggest concerns, give us again the top 5 real quick.
The first, of course, is effect on individual human health. Secondly, on migratory patterns. Third, on weather systems. Fourth, on the effect of possibly being able to create geophysical movement like earthquakes or volcanic eruptions. And I think the fifth overall is maybe we can categorize it as that which we cannot yet predict, because the energy thresholds are way above what would be able to give us that kind of predictability. There's a lot of fluidness in these technologies. I mean, that's the reason they experiment, is to find out what and why. The difference being, here we're dealing with billions of watts of power without really the kind of independent scrutiny that these kinds of programs really rightly ought to have. And I want to say this about a lot of the scientists on the front end of the project. I mean, they're approaching it in a very innocent way, in the sense that so much of what's happening with the program is compartmentalized, where they don't even know the full implications of what they're doing. But I can say, with certainty that, if you hit a certain threshold, you may create, in fact, they suggest that you will create a runaway effect that'll then stabilize at some unknown level. So once you've triggered the event, it would be like stopping the bullet once the primer's engaged. I mean, it's a little difficult at that stage of the game to pull the bullet back. And I think we're dealing with the same situation here. Once they pass that threshold, once they cross that frequency that triggers that nonlinear effect, that's where we're going to see the real impact and ramifications of the system, and that's where we're going to find out exactly what it does, and we're not going to be able to turn it off at that point. It's going to be engaged, and that will be that.
Okay, well, the problem that they had at WFAA and at the hospital is it took them apparently, hours and hours and hours to figure out what was causing these heart monitors to not operate. And of course, during that time period, somebody could have gone,
Yeah, that's right. And maybe they did. I mean, I don't know what the whole story was there, but this is again why we have to be so careful, as these systems are very sensitive. And when you think about it, that's affecting hardware. The fact of the matter is, human beings are not hardware. And yet, when you look at the human body, initially, people look at the outside and then start looking in. But what we really are, initially, is energy, and then atoms, and then molecules, and then body parts, and then body. And what you affect at an energetic level, as it affects hardware, so too the research is showing it affects us as if we were hardware, because we're a very sensitive instrument as a human being, and that's what makes us, living and human. At the same time, the electromagnetic nature of human beings is what's being violated here. It's a different kind of violation. It's a different kind of violation. It's a different kind of violation.
About weather from coast to coast. Do you ever see them reporting tornadoes in Montana and Wyoming, in Colorado? No, it's always Mississippi, Alabama, Texas, Oklahoma, Missouri, Florida, and two of them were spotted since I've been down here the last few days. Well, this was a rare high-altitude tornado that demolished 15,000 acres of timber. This is the highest elevation tornado probably in history, said Ted Puida, it's a Japanese name, of the University of Chicago. Now here's what the Edmonton Journal described of a July 31st, 1987 tornado. He said it was one of the worst disasters in Canadian history. 27 people were killed, 250 injured, and at least $150 million in property damage resulted. Tornadoes in Canada? He said in this weather disaster report that more damage was done in this one tornado than in all weather-related tornadoes combined in Canadian history. Only since the Soviets and the Americans began to cooperate in weather warfare, weather control. On December 19th, 1987, the Washington Post stated, quote, "The frigid air over Antarctica took 3 weeks longer than usual to warm at the onset of the Arctic spring this year, prompting concern that the ozone hole may be affecting global climate." Incidentally, the sprays that you have where the syrup carbons, they do not destroy ozone. What does destroy ozone is the extremely low-frequency magnetic waves. And in newspaper after newspaper article, and I will publish it in Newswatch magazine, they stated that the hole that they talk about in the ozone layer appeared suddenly in 1977, right after the Soviets began their emissions of extremely low-frequency magnetic waves. University of California scientist Sherwood Rowland, who was a leading expert in ozone depletion, said the event could be the first indication of a major climatic change in the climate that can disrupt planet Earth. Shortly afterwards, an enormous iceberg broke off the continent of Antarctica. The December 28, 1987 Newsweek magazine stated the following, I quote, "When an iceberg twice the size of Rhode Island broke off from Antarctica in October, it was clear that cartographers, which are map makers, would have to go back to the drawing board. The calved berg had ripped off a chunk of the southern continent's coast." End of quote. They went on to show that this was a signal for global warming. honestly feel that global warming is a fraud. I do too, except when extremely low-frequency magnetic waves are being used. To be exact, two other huge chunks, according to the February 9th, 1988 New York Times, broke off from Antarctica, which totally eliminated the Bay of Whales.
Coming up in the next segment with him, I'm going to play a short clip from Fox, and I've got other British news saying the same thing. We had this guy on a year ago, and the mainstream meteorologists and media were predicting basically hardly any winter, the end of snow, and he went in on our show, and he's a meteorologist and astrophysicist, and I've looked at his record. I mean, he's paid by different farmer almanacs, you name it, to really give farmers the real research. What the old timers knew, they didn't understand it. They just knew the moon had a big effect on the weather, and it's basically a lensing or amplifying effect with the solar winds that sends in so many particles into the atmosphere. Then there's the other big contributor, which is the magnetic field of the Earth, but it's also affected by the solar winds. Mainline meteorologists supposedly ignore all this and use these ridiculous computer models that the science has found is about as accurate as a Ouija board or a Wheel of Fortune. But Piers Corbin, year after year after year, and it's all chronicled at weatheraction.com, is accurate. A lot more accurate than the mainstream, and he predicted the coldest winter in a long time, massive snowfall, when it would hit, what would happen. And ladies and gentlemen, he did this almost a year out. I mean, this is incredible. And he does it over and over again, following the old-timer systems, which they didn't know why it was. They just knew the moon had to do with it. And he joins us, Piers Corbin, to talk about what's happening now and what he sees happening coming up throughout the summer and next year, or is that too early to tell? Piers Corbin, congratulations again on stunning accuracy.
Thanks very much. It's great to be here.
Well, you got the floor. We've only got you for 20 minutes. Tell us what's currently happening, how you predicted it, how it works, and what's coming up next.
Well, last May, we said at a conference, an energy conference, that December in Britain would be cold and snowy. We didn't give any more detail on that, but then in November, we put out a detailed forecast saying that we expected it would be the coldest December for 100 years. Nobody believed us. And that is in fact exactly what happened. In fact, it's the Central England temperatures are the second coldest in the full record of 352 years.
I'm going to have to interrupt you, Piers. I'm sorry. You were here in May of last year, and people can go to my YouTube channel or prisonplanet.tv and watch it. You said on the east coast of the U.S., incredible snowfall, freezing, Canada snowed in. You predicted a super cold winter. I mean, you're really playing down what you did.
Well, that's true. Yes, it's true. Fair enough. I was also going to add that we did, we predicted one very specific blizzard which hit New York just after Christmas, and we put out a detailed forecast for that 2 weeks ahead, although we'd had obviously ideas longer ahead.
Well, what is the truth? I mean, some news is saying the coldest in 1,000 years, but we don't have good records of that. Others are saying in 300. I mean, what's your evidence show? I mean, does this mark sliding into a new ice age, as many astrophysicists and meteorologists believe?
Yes, of course, the standard meteorology will just say everything's going to go back to the norm. Now, we say, well, in Europe and in many parts of America, for sure, it's going to carry on extremely cold in January and February. Our longer range view is that we are heading towards a mini ice age, and we'll
so much different than mainline meteorology? I mean, I know you've broken that down before, but explain that to people, and let's continue discussing what's happening this year and what you see coming next year.
Okay. Standard meteorology looks at the weather now, sees how everything's moving, and then says, well, if it's moving towards this, something will happen, and then it will do this and that, and they can predict forwards. However, after about 4 days, it breaks down, and it becomes very inaccurate. The reason for that is there's external influences driven from the sun and the moon interrupting the flow of charged particles from the sun. Now, this solar-lunar influence dictates the changes in the jet stream, which are the change in weather patterns. And what we've had in the last 6 months especially, and it's going to carry on this year, is significant jet stream blockings, whereby the jet stream is kept in more or less the same place for a while. And that has caused the super heat wave in Russia, for example, which we predicted, and we predicted when it would end. Caused the floods in Pakistan, and similarly we
I know, you predicted everything. You're a regular...
No, not everything.
No, I mean, I remember you in May of last year laying so much of this out. I mean, it's incredible.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, we are very pleased. We want to be able to predict everything. As it is, 85% of what we say will happen does happen, but there's a lot of things we haven't yet got a handle on. But some very interesting things going on right now, where it's so obvious that the Queensland floods, if you look at them, the most likely floods have all happened, the biggest floods, in the same phase of the eclipse cycle. Namely, there was an eclipse of the sun on January the 4th, which was near to the peak of this current wave of floods. And the previous waves of floods, very significant ones, were in 1954, 1992 or thereabouts, which are all separated by 19 years, which is the eclipse cycle. So there was also solar eclipses around the 4th of January, those times as well.
So just like a wind tunnel...
Solar effect is why you get the floods.
But I mean, for laymen out there, like a wind tunnel, I mean... So when the moon is basically directly lined up with the solar winds blocking them, what does that generally result in?
Well, it's more complicated than that. Where the moon is, obviously, given the date of an eclipse, also means there's certain patterns before and after that. And through the whole of its orbit, the moon is influencing the solar wind, which then influences the jet stream. What it seems is in certain phases of the eclipse cycle, the moon's motion is favouring jammings and stickings of the jet stream. And when you look at the rain map in Australia now, the standard meteorologists are pointing to this rain. They say, look, it's coming here and here, and it's staying there. It's always in this place. And then it's a stuck jet stream. Now they scratch their heads and don't know why. Well, we know why. We don't know the detailed mechanisms, but we do know why.
Okay, why?
When it's going to happen.
Why? What's triggering it then? I mean, we understand the moon in relation to the sun and the solar wind.
Well, the jet stream would be moving normally all the time, but somehow the moon interrupts the jet stream so that the motion, interrupts the solar wind so that the motion of the jet stream becomes stuck. Now, we don't understand the details of how it works, but we can say when that type of thing is going to happen and when the jammings of the jet stream will break down.
Well, meteorologist and astrophysicist, consultant and owner of WeatherAction.com, who makes weather forecasts up to a year in advance with 85% accuracy. No one else can even get close to that. How can I, just as an average Joe, not a rocket scientist, know that the tides are caused by the moon? So why wouldn't the moon, if it can do that, affect the weather when we know the ocean is one of the biggest terrestrial drivers of the weather? How can mainline meteorology ignore that? I mean, that's moronic, is it not?
Well, it is moronic, yes. But you see, they can't cope with what to do, and they don't know how to put it in. I mean, they could be a lot more intelligent and make applications, but you see, in
maybe that the main drivers of all these things are external, it's the sun and the moon, then they're going to have to ditch their man-made climate change theory, and that is the core of their belief system. So the Met Office in Britain now has even got to the stage where they put on the website it was going to be a mild winter, then it was cold, so then they announced that they'd actually thought it was going to be cold and had told the government this. Now, this is just unbelievable. I just don't believe them, frankly. It's very possible they put out two forecasts and afterwards they would say which one they really believed in. Obviously the one that was right, but this can say that in fact it's all caused by CO2. I mean, they come up with it's warming. Somehow CO2 has caused some warming somewhere, which has caused a change in circulation, which has caused these blasts of cold air. Well, it's complete nonsense because we can predict these blasts. They're caused by solar lunar influence. It's nothing whatsoever to do with carbon dioxide.
Unbelievable. Stay there. Piers Corbin coming back with us. We'll look into the rest of 2011 into 2012, what his yearly forecast is this time. It's a little early, but everybody in the next few months, we'll get an early thing. And so because they want to push man-made global warming, they have this quackery that the moon and the sun, and they said that last year at Copenhagen, an official UN declaration that the sun does not affect climate. The sun is the driver, is it not, astrophysicist, meteorologist Piers Corbin?
That's right, the sun drives it, and the main climate driver is through magnetic effects involving charged particles modulated by lunar influences. And the main cycles of weather observed on Earth are in fact solar-lunar driven. The 60-year cycle in the Pacific temperatures and American temperatures is a solar-lunar effect, and that modulates, if you like, the main magnetic effect, which is a 22-year cycle of world temperatures.
So what is the current cycle point we're in right now, and what do you see coming up in the next 12 months?
Right, what we've got now is we're leaving the solar minimum. We've left solar cycle 23 and we're in the start of solar cycle 24, and it's been hiccuping in its starting, and it's a lot of solar activity has tended to be low, and at the same time we're in a very fortuitous, if you like, lunar phase in the eclipse cycle of the moon, where we've just had some eclipses, and these appear to be accentuating the blocking tendencies of the jet stream, which we predict, and these blocking tendencies are very important for extreme events. They're leading to these extreme cold situations in Britain and Europe, and your major blizzards and cold blasts in America. They also lead to very warm bits in different parts at times, but the key thing is right now the extreme cold experience. And these extreme blockings are going to continue through January and February and right through the year. So we'll see a lot of extreme type of things, a lot more cold spells than the global warmers would like us to have. And it'll generally look like a kind of different weather situation where we'll go through this year compared with previous years. We've entered some sort of pretty fundamental shift, I would say, in weather patterns.
Again, here's my simpleton question. Obviously, the moon is involved in the same orbits and gyrations and is stable, but the sun, do we have any idea on its short cycles? Obviously not its long cycles, so it looks to me like that's a major variable in that the sun is fluctuating and we don't know, so we have to always understand that's the big wild card, because though even the ancients understood the relationship with the moon and the sea and the overall weather, isn't the sun the big wild card?
Well, yes and no. There's a lot of things on the sun which are happening, which we can't see, but we nevertheless know they happen and change the way in which the solar wind gets to us and the magnetic linkages, and we can predict some of those very well. Like we know there's certainly going to be
different particles, the micrometeorites, all of it, coming in out of the solar rocks over the Earth and its magnetic field, and that when the moon is between the Earth and the sun, or not between the Earth and the sun, it has a massive effect on what's coming into the atmosphere. Then, one of the other big feeds or inputs is the magnetics of the planet from the core affecting weather on the surface because of the massive magnetic tectonic type energies being released.
It's a different kind of violation.